Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. The view from our condo stretched out across Santa Clara Valley, all glass and steel reflecting the early evening light. Below, the city pulsed, tech firms still alive with late-night coding sessions, venture capitalists whining and dining the next big disruptor, Teslas sliding through the streets like silent sharks. While you're here, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know. I had spent years climbing this world. Built my name in boardrooms, closed deals in private lounges, played the game better than most. Now, I was exactly where I wanted to be. And standing at the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of wine, was the woman who had been by my side through all of it. Emily. Elegant. Calculated. The kind of woman who could sit through a meeting with billionaires and make them think it was their idea to give her what she wanted. She ran a boutique marketing agency, small compared to the giants in the valley, but powerful enough that CEOs knew her name. People underestimated her at their own risk. She took a sip of wine, scrolling through something on her phone. Jacob called, she said, not looking up. I set my whiskey down. About? She glanced at me, lips curving slightly. He and Lauren are hosting another one of their get-togethers. Said it has been too long since everyone was in the same room. That meant one thing, deals would be made. Jacob West was one of my closest friends, but he was also one of the savviest startup founders in the game. He had built his company from nothing, and now it was one of the most talked about AI firms in the country. Mason Turner, the other constant in our circle, had made his fortune in biotech. He was more reserved than Jacob, more methodical, but when he spoke, people listened. Their wives, Lauren and Heather, were the kind of women who understood power without needing to flaunt it. They moved differently than Emily. Less overt, more refined. The quiet force behind their husbands' empires. I picked up my glass again. You want to go? Emily shrugged, eyes still on her screen. Might be interesting. That was as much enthusiasm as I was going to get from her. Which meant we were going. Jacob's home was a modern estate tucked into the hills of Los Altos, all sleek architecture and sprawling windows that made sure no one ever forgot how much money he had. By the time we arrived, the place was already alive with conversation. The usual faces were there. Investors, engineers, a few early-stage founders hoping to get a foot in the door. Jacob greeted us at the entrance, his signature grin in place. Brooks. About time. I shook his hand. Trying to keep things balanced, West. Not everyone can spend their life throwing parties. He laughed, guiding us inside. When you make enough money, you can do both. Emily peeled off toward Lauren and Heather, slipping into conversation with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years. Jacob led me toward the main lounge, where Mason was already waiting, glass in hand. David, Mason said, nodding. Mason. He studied me. I assume Jacob dragged you into this? Jacob smirked. He loves it. Just will not admit it. I took a slow sip of whiskey, glancing around. What is the real reason we are here? Jacob leaned in slightly. New opportunity. Something that is going to change the landscape. I raised a brow. Go on. But before he could, my attention shifted. Across the room, Emily stood with Lauren and Heather, her expression poised, polished. But something about the way she held herself was different tonight. And standing just a little too close to her, speaking in low tones, was a man I did not recognize. Tall, dark suit, confident stance. I watched as he said something that made her smile. Not the polite, practiced smile she gave during business meetings. Something else. Something real. Jacob followed my gaze, then let out a short laugh. Oh, you have met Nathaniel Grant yet? My grip tightened around my glass. No. Jacob nodded toward the man. Big name in fintech. Just closed a major acquisition. People are saying he is going to be the next king of Silicon Valley. Mason glanced between me and Emily, eyes sharp. Interesting, he murmured. Jacob chuckled. Relax, Brooks. Your wife knows how to play the game. I did not take my eyes off them. So do I. Emily lifted her wine glass, tilting her head slightly as she listened to whatever Nathaniel was saying. Then, for the briefest moment, she glanced in my direction. And for the first time in a long time, I had the distinct sense that she was calculating something. Not for business. For herself. Emily had always been strategic about networking. She moved through Silicon Valley like a seasoned executive, knowing exactly when to charm, when to negotiate, when to retreat. She was selective with her time, never wasting it on pointless small talk or low-level deals. So when I started noticing her spending an unusual amount of time with Jacob and Mason, something felt off. It was subtle at first, Meetings that ran late. Calls that ended the second I walked into the room. Weekend brunches that she suddenly claimed were for business development. I let it slide. Until the night I saw her car parked outside Jacob's office. It was nearly 11 when I drove past the high-rise where Jacob's company operated. I had not planned on being there. I had taken an alternate route home after dinner with a potential investor. But as I turned onto the street, my eyes caught a familiar shape in the lot. Emily's car. Parked. Engine off. No reason for her to be there at this hour. Jacob's company had closed hours ago. The only lights still on were from the upper floors, where executives held private meetings. Or something else. I pulled over a block away, far enough to stay unnoticed. I watched the building, waiting. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, the elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Jacob stepped out first, walking with that easy confidence he always carried. Emily followed. She laughed at something he said, touching his arm lightly, the way she used to do with me when we first started dating. They walked to the parking lot, standing too close, speaking too quietly. Then, without hesitation, Jacob reached out and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. She did not pull away. She smiled. A few more words were exchanged before she turned, got into her car, and drove off. Jacob lingered, watching her leave. Then he walked back inside, like nothing had happened. Like this was routine. I did not confront her that night. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Emily's phone was always close by, but she was not as careful as she thought. One morning, while she was in the shower, I picked it up. No passcode change. A mistake. The messages were there, hidden in plain sight. Jacob, you were incredible last night. Emily, you always say that. Jacob, because it is true. I scrolled. Further down, another conversation. This time with Mason. Mason, wish I had you to myself tonight. Emily, you had me last weekend. Mason, not enough. I leaned against the counter, processing. Not one affair. 2. With the men who were supposed to be my closest friends. A quiet rage settled into my chest. Not the kind that explodes. The kind that simmers. The kind that waits. I put the phone back exactly where I found it. Then I walked out of the house. I needed a plan. Emily had been playing her game for a while. Now, it was my turn. Emily walked through the door like nothing had changed. She set her keys down, kicked off her heels, and moved toward the bar, pouring herself a glass of wine. I watched her from across the room, leaning against the counter, waiting. She took a sip, sighing like she had a long day. You were home early. I nodded. Yeah. She glanced over, finally registering my expression. What? I picked up my phone, scrolled, and placed it on the counter between us. She frowned, setting her glass down. Her eyes flicked to the screen. Messages. Jacob. Mason. All laid out in front of her. She inhaled sharply, then schooled her face into something neutral. Why are you going through my phone? I let out a slow breath. That is what you want to focus on? She swallowed, as darting between me and the evidence in front of her. You are misinterpreting things. I tilted my head. Am I? She straightened, crossing her arms. It is not what you think. I nodded slowly. All right. Tell me what it is then. She hesitated. I pushed off the counter, walking toward her, keeping my voice measured. I saw you outside Jacob's office the other night. She blinked, surprised. I saw the way you touched his arm, I continued. The way he touched you. Her lips parted, but she did not speak. You want to try again? Her shoulders tensed. David. I picked up my phone and scrolled further. Jacob, you were incredible last night. Emily, you always say that. I looked up, eyes locked on hers. She swallowed hard. David, please. I scrolled again. Mason, wish I had you to myself tonight. Emily, you had me last weekend. Her breath caught. I took a step closer, voice low. So tell me, Emily, how exactly am I misinterpreting that? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then, finally, she exhaled. It just happened. I let out a humorless laugh. Right. You just accidentally ended up in bed with 2 of my closest friends. She ran a hand through her hair, her composure cracking. I was caught up, David. It was never meant to be serious. I clenched my jaw. That is supposed to make it better? Her voice softened, turning careful. I still love you. I let the words hang between us for a moment. Then I laughed again, shaking my head. You do not even know what love is. Her expression faltered. For the first time, real panic flickered in her eyes. Because she knew. This was not something I would forgive. She took a small step forward. David, we can talk about this. Please. I stared at her. Then I exhaled, rolling my shoulders back. No, I said, my voice calm. We cannot talk about this. Her face fell. David, I turned, picking up my phone, sliding it into my pocket. You made your choice, Emily. I started toward the door. Where are you going? She called after me. I paused, glancing back. To handle this my way. Then I walked out. And she did not try to stop me. Because she knew I was about to burn everything down. I did not go home. Instead, I drove. No real destination at first, just the city lights stretching ahead, streets I knew too well blurring past. I had built my life here. Built my career, my reputation, my legacy. And now, two men I had trusted, two men I had considered friends, were trying to tear it apart. I was not going to let them. I needed leverage. I needed control. And there were two people who could help me get it. Lauren West and Heather Turner. Jacob and Mason's wives. They were more than just the women behind the men. They were the ones who really kept things running. And if my instincts were right, they had no idea what their husbands had been up to. That was about to change. The wine bar was quiet, the kind of place where high-profile deals were discussed behind hushed voices and $100 bottles. Lauren and Heather were already there when I arrived, seated in a private corner, two glasses of red in front of them. Heather spotted me first. David? Lauren's gaze sharpened. What is going on? I slid into the seat across from them, placing my phone face down on the table. We need to talk. They exchanged glances. Heather leaned back slightly. This sounds serious. I let the silence stretch before speaking. It is about your husbands. Lauren frowned. What about them? I looked her in the eye. They are sleeping with Emily. Heather stilled. Lauren blinked, like she had misheard me. Then she let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. That is not funny. I did not smile. I reached for my phone, pulled up the messages, and slid it across the table. Heather hesitated before picking it up. She scrolled, her fingers tightening around the glass in her other hand. Lauren leaned over, reading the screen. Her face darkened. That son of a... She cut herself off, breathing through her nose. Heather set the phone down, exhaling slowly. How long? Months, I said. Maybe longer. Lauren clenched her jaw, her nails tapping against the stem of her glass. He really thought I would never find out. I nodded toward Heather. And Mason? She shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. He always said he was too busy for distractions. Turns out, he just found ones that suited him. Neither of them looked shocked. Angry? Yes. Betrayed? Definitely. But surprised? Not entirely. That told me they had been suspecting something for a while. Lauren exhaled, shifting in her seat. What are you going to do? I leaned forward. That depends on you. Heather arched a brow. Meaning? You are not just their wives, I said. You are also their business partners. They both went still. And that was when I knew I had them. Heather was the first to speak. How much do you know? Enough. I rested my elbows on the table. I know both of you are financial backers in their latest ventures. I know you have equity. I know you have leverage. Lauren's lips pressed together. If this gets out, it could ruin everything. Exactly, I said. Investors pull out when they see instability. They do not like distractions. They do not like bad press. And they definitely do not like high-profile scandals involving their money. Heather exhaled slowly, fingers tapping against her glass. You want to use that against them. I met her gaze. I want to make sure they pay for what they have done. Lauren leaned forward. What do you have in mind? I smirked. Now we were getting somewhere. We spent the next hour talking. They were furious, but they were also calculating. They knew this could not be an emotional reaction. It had to be a strategy. By the end of the night, we had a plan. One that would not just expose Jacob and Mason, but one that would destroy them. Heather drained the rest of her wine, setting the glass down with deliberate force. They are not going to see this coming. Lauren nodded, a dangerous glint in her eye. They thought they were in control. I leaned back in my seat, feeling something close to satisfaction. Not anymore. Lauren swirled what was left of her wine, staring at the deep red liquid like it held the answer to everything. Heather sat back, arms crossed, the tension in her jaw betraying the storm raging behind her calm expression. They were both thinking the same thing I was. This was not just about betrayal. This was about control. Jacob and Mason had been reckless, playing their games in the open, assuming their wives would never question them, assuming I would never put the pieces together. They thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. Lauren set her glass down. We have to be careful. Heather nodded. This cannot look like a revenge stunt. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. We make them fall, but we do it in a way that does not blow back on us. No messy drama. No public outbursts. We control the narrative. Lauren tapped her fingers against the table. How much proof do you have? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the saved messages. Then I pushed it toward her. She skimmed through, her expression tightening. This is enough to start a scandal, but not enough to finish them. Heather tilted her head. Meaning? Lauren pushed the phone back. We need more than texts. We need undeniable proof. I nodded. I can get it. Heather leaned in slightly. What is your endgame, David? I looked her in the eye. Public humiliation. She smirked. Good. But we need to be smart. Lauren crossed her arms. We time this right. And we do not just expose them, we cripple them. I nodded. Then let's make a plan. Over the next week, we moved carefully. I started with the digital trail. Emails, travel receipts, hidden expenses. Emily had been careful, but not careful enough. She had exchanged personal messages with Jacob and Mason through encrypted apps, but there were still traces. Booking confirmations, private dinners labeled as client meetings, luxury hotel stays that lined up too perfectly with their schedules. Lauren and Heather worked from the inside. Lauren had access to Jacob's business accounts. Heather had Mason's. It did not take long before they started finding the cracks. Hidden expenses buried under corporate entertainment. Trips listed as business development that had no corresponding investor meetings. Every single transaction was another nail in the coffin. Heather sent me a file one evening. This one is my favorite, she wrote. I opened it. A flight itinerary. Emily and Mason. First-class tickets. Destination, Maui. Paid for by company funds. I exhaled slowly. This was exactly what we needed. Lauren tapped her pen against the table, staring at the files we had gathered. This is enough. Heather nodded. They cannot talk their way out of this. I leaned back in my chair. Time for the final act. Lauren glanced at me. Where do we drop the bomb? I smirked. The Founders Gala. Heather's lips curled into a slow smile. Perfect. The annual Founders Gala was the crown jewel of Silicon Valley's social calendar. CEOs, investors, tech billionaires, all in one place. Deals worth millions were made over champagne and handshakes. A scandal like this? It would spread fast. Lauren picked up her phone. I will make sure they attend. Heather cracked her knuckles. And I will make sure they never see it coming. I stood, rolling my shoulders back. Jacob, Mason, and Emily had been playing their game for months. Now, it was our turn, and we were about to end it. The ballroom at the Regency Grand shimmered with wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, conversations flowing effortlessly between tech billionaires and venture capitalists. Deals were being made in real time. The right handshake here, a whispered agreement there. A single introduction tonight could lead to a multi-million-dollar investment tomorrow. It was the perfect place to watch everything fall apart. Emily arrived wearing confidence like armor. Her dress, black, sleek, perfectly fitted, announced that she belonged among the elite. She moved between conversations with practiced ease, charming investors, slipping effortlessly into discussions about marketing strategy and brand positioning. Jacob and Mason were already working the room, shaking hands, laughing in all the right places. They were here to secure the next round of funding for their startups, rubbing elbows with people who controlled more money than entire governments. They had no idea they were walking into their own destruction. Lauren and Heather were stationed strategically. Lauren sipped champagne near the investors' lounge, where a handful of major players were discussing potential acquisitions. She had already dropped a few pointed remarks about her husband's questionable recent business expenses. Heather had positioned herself near a well-known journalist. Not for an interview. Not yet. Just a casual conversation, carefully leading the reporter toward an interesting story. I waited near the main bar, watching. Jacob's voice carried across the room. We have built something truly innovative. This is going to disrupt the entire industry. A group of investors nodded along, intrigued. He had them right where he wanted them. Mason was a few steps away, deep in conversation with a potential buyer for his biotech firm. He was talking fast, gesturing slightly with his drink, selling the vision. And then there was Emily. She was with Nathaniel Grant, the fintech CEO who had been circling our group for weeks. She laughed at something he said, touching his arm lightly, tilting her head just enough to make it seem natural. Jacob and Mason may have been her favorites, but Emily was always looking for the next opportunity. She was playing the game. She did not know she was about to lose. Lauren caught my eye from across the room. She gave a subtle nod. It was time. I made my way toward the investors' lounge, where Jacob was still holding court. As I approached, one of the investors, Brett Calloway, a major player in the AI space, turned to me. "David, good to see you. We were just talking about some interesting things your friends here have been working on." I smiled. "Oh, I am sure you were." Jacob grinned, unaware of what was coming. "David has been a key supporter of our ventures. He knows exactly how valuable these projects are." I held his gaze. "Oh, I do." Mason shifted slightly. "You came at the perfect time. We were just discussing some exciting expansions." I nodded. "I bet you were." Then I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the files Lauren and Heather had helped me gather, and placed it face up on the table. Receipts, emails, booking confirmations, all paid for with company funds, all linked to personal trips and client meetings that had nothing to do with business. Jacob's smile faltered first. Mason went completely still. Brett frowned, picking up the phone, scrolling through the evidence. "What exactly am I looking at here?" he asked. I exhaled, slow and controlled. "A record of certain unauthorized expenditures." Jacob opened his mouth, but Lauren stepped forward before he could speak. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip looking almost affectionate. "It was not. It appears," she said smoothly, "that some of our husbands have been mismanaging company funds." Heather leaned in slightly. "And using those funds to finance personal indulgences." Mason swallowed hard. Lauren cut him off. "And if that is not bad enough, they have also been deeply involved with David's wife." Silence. Heavy. Waited. One of the investors muttered something under his breath. A few others exchanged glances. Emily had frozen across the room, sensing the shift. She turned, eyes locking onto mine. She knew. Everything was about to crash, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Jacob and Mason were still trying to recover. The investors had gone quiet, staring at the evidence on the phone screen. Brett Calloway, who had been considering a major deal with Jacob's company, set his drink down carefully. "This is unexpected." Jacob forced a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. "This is being taken out of context." Lauren leaned in, still resting a hand on his shoulder. "Which part, darling? The personal vacations paid for with company money? Or the affair with Emily?" Mason turned toward Heather, eyes sharp. "You were really doing this here?" Heather gave him a slow, deliberate smile. "Yes, Mason. We are." Jacob started to speak again, but Lauren squeezed his shoulder, not hard, but firm enough to make her point. "Not another word," she said softly. His mouth snapped shut. Emily had been watching from across the room. Now she stepped forward, her voice carefully controlled. "David, can we talk privately?" I exhaled, rolling my shoulders back. "No." Her expression flickered. "You do not want to make a scene." I tilted my head. "Oh, I do." I turned to the host of the gala, who had just stepped onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom. "Would you mind if I borrowed the mic?" I asked. The host blinked. Lauren touched his arm, smiling. "It will be worth it." That was all it took. A moment later, I was holding the microphone, standing at the center of the room. All eyes turned to me. Emily stopped in her tracks. Jacob and Mason stiffened. I smiled, easy and relaxed. "Good evening, everyone. I will not take up too much of your time, but since we are all gathered here, investors, entrepreneurs, the brightest minds in Silicon Valley, I thought I would take a moment to talk about trust." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I gestured toward the large screen behind me. Trust is the foundation of every business relationship. It is what allows companies to thrive. It is what gives investors confidence in the people they support. I clicked the remote in my hand. The screen flickered to life. At first, it was a standard corporate pitch slide. Then I clicked again. The next image appeared. A screenshot of a text exchange. "Jacob, you were incredible last night." "Emily, you always say that." A gasp echoed from someone in the back. Jacob's face drained of color. I clicked again. Another screenshot. "Mason, wish I had you to myself tonight." "Emily, you had me last weekend." Someone near the bar muttered, "Oh, damn." I clicked again. An email appeared, detailing a 5-star Maui resort stay, paid for with company funds. Mason swore under his breath. I clicked again. Another trip. A different city. A different luxury hotel. The same names. Jacob stepped forward, voice desperate. "David, stop." I clicked again. The final slide appeared. A list of expenses. Names. Dates. A tangled web of stolen money and private indulgences. The silence was deafening. Then someone laughed. Low, sharp. Lauren. She stepped forward, lifting her glass. To Jacob and Mason, she said, voice carrying through the stunned ballroom. For showing us all how not to run a company. Scattered laughter, hesitant at first, then growing. Heather took Mason's abandoned drink from the table, lifting it in mock salute. And to Emily, for proving that bad investments are not just financial. More laughter. Jacob turned to Lauren, his voice tight. Do you realize what you have done? She smiled sweetly. Oh, absolutely. Emily's face was frozen, her eyes darting between me and the crowd. David, please. I handed the mic back to the host. Enjoy the rest of your night. Then I stepped off the stage, walking past her without another glance. Because this game was over, and I had already won. The silence in the ballroom stretched, thick with judgment and disbelief. Jacob and Mason stood like statues, their carefully constructed reputations crumbling in real time. Emily, still in the center of the disaster she had created, was frozen in place, her nails digging into the fabric of her clutch. The ripple effect of the scandal had begun. Investors whispered to one another, some already pulling out their phones, likely texting assistants and financial advisors. A few had stepped away from the crowd entirely, their interest in Jacob and Mason's companies evaporating by the second. Lauren and Heather, the real power players in the room, had never looked more composed. Heather smoothed a hand over her dress, then turned to the nearest investor, a silver-haired venture capitalist with a long track record of backing billion-dollar startups. Of course, none of this changes the strength of the companies themselves, she said smoothly. Lauren nodded. Exactly. The foundation is strong. But for the sake of transparency, some restructuring will be necessary. The silver-haired investor raised an eyebrow. Restructuring? Lauren smiled. We need to remove problematic leadership. Jacob finally snapped out of his stupor. Are you kidding me? His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it was panic. Mason stepped toward Heather. You cannot just push us out. Heather arched a brow. Oh, Mason. Watch me. Jacob's hands curled into fists. We built these companies from the ground up. Lauren turned to him, her voice as sweet as it was lethal. And now you're going to watch us take them away. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Investors who had once been firmly in Jacob and Mason's corner were nodding along, reassessing their alliances. A tall man in a navy suit stepped forward. He was one of the largest private equity players in the valley, the kind of person whose name alone could make or break a deal. Honestly, gentlemen, he said, adjusting his cufflinks, this might be the smartest move for everyone. If you step down quietly, the companies survive. If you fight it, well, you know how the markets respond to scandal. Jacob's breathing was uneven now. He turned to me, desperate. David, he said, his voice tight. Tell them. You know these companies are our vision. I exhaled, pretending to consider it. Then I smiled. I do not care. Jacob recoiled slightly, as if the realization had just dawned on him. I turned to the investors. Lauren and Heather are right. The business itself is still strong. The issue is leadership. But if certain people remove themselves, I am sure things can stabilize. Lauren gave me a small nod of approval. Heather lifted her glass. To new beginnings. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone chuckled. Jacob and Mason were out. The only question left was how long it would take them to accept it. But they were not the only ones facing consequences. Emily had been standing off to the side, gripping her glass so tightly I thought it might crack. She finally stepped forward, lowering her voice. David, can we talk? I turned. Talk? I let out a short laugh. You had plenty of opportunities for that. Her throat bobbed. Not like this. I glanced around the room. You do not want an audience? She flinched. Please. I looked at her for a long moment, letting her sit in her own desperation. Then I shook my head. No, her breath caught. David, I tilted my head. You are embarrassed. That is what this is. You do not regret what you did. You regret getting caught. She swallowed hard, glancing at the dozens of faces still watching. Some of them whispered. Some smirked. A few had their phones out, likely recording. She stepped closer. We can fix this. I exhaled, feigning patience. Emily, let me make this simple for you. I turned to face the entire room. For those of you wondering, I said, voice carrying easily, yes, I will be filing for divorce. A collective murmur spread through the crowd. A few cameras flashed. Emily took a shaky step back. David, please. I smiled, slow and sharp. No. Then I turned to Jacob and Mason, who were still trying to process the wreckage. As for you two, I said, my tone almost amused. Good luck. I walked past them, straight to the exit. I did not need to stay for the fallout. I had already won, and they would spend the rest of their lives trying to recover from it. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.